Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, everyone. Since we're mostly anthropologists or ethnomusicologists, and I'm an anthropologist by marriage, it's important that we start with a ritual, which will be, I will take off my jacket. So since it's such a warm day. In some ways, this is a paper I should have given yesterday because it's, in some ways, I think it's clearer and it's more introductory to questions of value. But I wanted to give you the world premiere paper yesterday to kick things off. So there will be a little bit of familiar language in here. But in case I wasn't very clear yesterday, maybe it'll be clearer today. So without anything else, let me jump in. This presentation continues my interest in questions of value of musical goods, going back at least to my work on music as a commodity, which goes back 11 years or so, and questions of non-economic forms of value. The essential question concerns how we can develop ways of understanding the value of music that are not just economic or economistic. As anthropologist Michael Lambeck notes in his consideration of value, there's a difference between playing a violin for a living and playing it for pleasure, playing it for its own sake. Both activities produce value, but the former is a kind of economic form of value, and the latter isn't, though it can be brought into an economic regime of value. It is this second form of value of musical performance that interests me here. How can a musical performance be a medium of this sort of value? In reading recent anthropological theories of value, to which I am very much indebted, it seems to me that Clifford Geertz's concern for questions of what is meaningful to social actors is really a way of thinking about what they value. Geertz's early work bears out this impression, for he sometimes uses the words meaning and feeling or affect and value interchangeably. Value, like meaning, is social. It circulates everywhere, and everywhere it is contested, protected, and shifting. Recent authors of in the anthropological literature on value tend not to recognize the debt to Geertz, like David Graeber, for example, but these writings have helped deepen my understanding of questions of meaning. According to these authors, value is how we find meaning in what we do, and how this meaning or value is understood by a society or a culture more generally. Capitalism is therefore only one mode of the creation and exchange of value. Goods that are thought to possess value are produced in all forms of social relations, not just capitalism. Value is also not static. A good might not be produced as a commodity, but can become one. But if this happens, it is not necessarily a commodity forever. It can become a gift or another sort of good. Goods have careers and exist in what Arjun Appadurai has influentially called regimes of value, sets of shared standards in which similar degrees of value coherence exist. This presentation is concerned with understanding musical performance as a medium of value. How can a transient, ephemeral action serve as a medium of articulation of the values of a particular social group? And how might this work? We currently have many excellent treatments of the question of the value of goods that are commodities from Marx and later writers, and we have many useful considerations of the value of goods that are considered to be gifts, drawing on Marcel Mauss and later writers. We also possess many illuminating anthropological and ethnomusicological studies of ritual that demonstrate the ways that rituals produce or reproduce or create and recreate social life or society itself. But aiming at questions of value helps provide focus. What exactly is being produced or reproduced or created and recreated beyond society or culture? Terence Turner's discussions of questions of indigenous people struggles in the face of colonial or other sorts of contact gives urgency to such issues of the specificities of value. This is the paper I talked about yesterday. Turner exhorts us to focus on optimizing people's ability to create or manage cultural patterns for their own ends, which, he says, should be the main political criterion. As societies continue to change, whether internally or through external forces, questions about the maintenance of what those societies collectively value would seem to be worth our continued attention. Turner offers a theory of value, which is essentially worked out in greater ethnographic and theoretical detail in David Graeber's Value book, in which he argues, quote, action is conceived as oriented towards socially defined values. Sociocultural systems are accordingly understood as the means by which people define the values that orient their own acts, realize those values in concrete terms through concerted social action, and distribute and accumulate the value thus produced among themselves. That's the end of the quote. Note here the employment of values and value, which is another issue to address before I can really get going. This is something that Graeber takes up in his book, and there's no need to spend a lot of time on that question here. Graeber argues that there are three areas of thought that come together in the term value: values in the sociological sense, value in the economic sense, and value in the linguistic sense, going back to de Saussure, and that he says can be understood as meaningful difference. Graeber writes that all three usages of the term are essentially versions of the same thing, which he then goes on to attempt to demonstrate in his book. Ultimately, he comes to argue for a capacious conceptualization of value that is concerned with understanding how people imagine what life should be like. Anthropological theories of value posit that value needs to be stored in some way, in some sort of concrete token, like money. This is one of the main points that Graeber makes, and Goetz himself makes a similar point. But Graeber also discusses rituals and performances as media of value, and it is an elaboration of this idea that serves as the main goal of this presentation. Other theorists also allow that value can be preserved in immaterial ways, though this is not the focus of most theories of value, with a few exceptions like Michael Lambeck, who has a different take on this. The question of value with respect to performed music, instead of music fixed in a concrete commodity, such as a recording, is complex. What kind of medium of value might a musical performance be? Performances, like physical musical goods, can be commodities in the sense that they are events repeated to crowds consisting mostly of strangers, as Marx himself argued about performances. But they are still different than recorded musical sound commodities in their ephemerality. And what one considers to be a performance can vary quite a bit. Some, of course, are public events, but others can be smaller, more intimate affairs for friends or aficionados. Performances can be rituals or parts of rituals, and they can take still other forms. The Irish music session that I planned, we don't think of that as a performance. It's like hanging out with music. Discussions of value such as those I've gone over have been extremely useful in focusing on what is meaningful for social actors while keeping the big picture in mind. As Graeber reminds us, value theory helps understand a particular system of exchange as part of larger systems of meaning. Oh, as usual, I forgot to start the PowerPoint. I hate these things, but it's helpful. I mean, hearing talks in a foreign language, I know it's helpful for such things. So that was the introduction. Now we're on to this. If musical performance is a medium of value, then it must be seen by everyone involved, or seen as such as everyone involved, performers and non-performers, though this is a distinction I will have to problematize in a minute. I am thus concerned with the ways that value can be potentially transmitted, or realized, consummated, through musical performance, and how these transmissions are made, though I will have less concern here with how these transmissions are received and understood. If value is something collectively realized, then performances must be something that are public in the sense that they are not simply for those considered to be the performers, when such a distinction exists. Performances require audiences. Performance is socially and culturally recognized as such, like knowing the difference between a blink and a wink. Right, that's Goetz's famous discussion. What is socially and culturally recognized as performance is set apart from the everyday in many ways. Formally, with musicians separated from the audience, wearing special dress, amplified, and so on, or more informally. Stephen Feld writes of what he calls the staging among the Kaluli in Papua New Guinea of a particular genre of music. Staging, he writes, is the way that the audience is primed to understand musical form and style as meaningful and intentional representations of sentiments. Performances or rituals or other sorts of public events are seen as something different than the real or the everyday, even if they can help us make sense of or find meaning in the real or the everyday. Let me make it clear that while my main concern is attempting to understand musical performances in contemporary capitalist societies, in many societies there is not a clear-cut distinction to be made between performance and performers and audience. Everyone may be a participant. The canonical example in ethnomusicology is probably Anthony Seeger's brilliant analysis of the mouse ceremony among the Suya, who now prefer to be called the Kiseje people of Brazil. But even contemporary capitalist societies, I would argue, the behavior and activity of the audience must be considered to be a part of the performance itself. Because performances are socially and culturally understood as performances, they are, by this definition, public. Singing in the shower is not a performance, though it certainly may provide something of value to the singer. And it is because performances are public that they can act as tokens of value to particular societies or social groups. Value is public as meaning is, since both are cultural. This is very Goetzian. Though such a position requires that we remember that meanings don't circulate to everyone the same way, and that they never circulate totally. There's always somebody at some performance who says, "Oh, they were terrible," or they failed to move me, or it doesn't always work. So I have to use all this language of potentially. Value is potentially transmitted, or as you will see. Everyone who has performed knows that there is a vast difference between practicing or rehearsing without an audience. It is not a performance without the audience. Early performers in radio studios and recording studios suffered rough transitions from performing before an audience to performing before a microphone, as many spoke and wrote about at the time. This is really fascinating literature, I have to say. Some of it is collected in that reader I did that came out in 2012 with Mark Katz and Tony Grigida. The point here is that performances are public and do not exist without audiences, whether present and seen or present and unseen. Without an audience, there is no performance and no potential medium of value or its realization, confirmation, consummation. And if there is no performance without an audience, the audience itself is part of the performance. If all this is correct, then the interactions between people considered to be performers and those considered to be part of the audience, where such a distinction exists, are a crucial part of what one must consider to be the performance. Value has no chance of being transmitted without the interaction of people involved in the performance. People interact with musicians and other sorts of performers in a variety of ways, from seeming to behave passively while ostensibly listening closely, as at classical music concerts, or dancing in the aisles or at other sorts of concerts. Every concert scene of which I'm aware has proper ways, that is, socially proper ways of expressing approbation or admiration for the performers. Every genre has its expected mode of the demonstration of appreciation, which one could consider to be the successful transmission of value. If expectations are not met, value is diminished, or maybe hasn't been transmitted. Sometimes different regimes of value are knowingly exchanged. If, in a sort of music that is supposed to induce ecstasy or trance, fails to do so, the conscious listener is still lucid enough to note the effectiveness of the musician's work on others, or in some cases offer money to the musicians. This is regular Qureshi's famous discussion. This, I suppose, is a form over time of generalized reciprocity, a system in which transactions that are putatively altruistic, transactions on the line of assistance given and, if possible and necessary, assistance returned. Sometimes the musicians get recognized and or paid, and sometimes they don't, but either way, they are creating value that is sometimes recognized in the form of the music's effectiveness or in the form of money. Different sorts of cultural goods are consumed differently. as we know, perhaps most famously from Bourdieu, the Distinction book. Though while reception has been reasonably frequently studied in music, attention to modes of reception and interaction are less common. Musical performances have different sorts of audience interactions that are quite revealing of the values on display being potentially transmitted or realized. At classical music performances, for example, audience members are supposed to sit in rapt silence as in church. No applause is permitted except at the ends of works, no matter how spectacular or pleasing a particular moment in the performance might have been. Classical music concerts are about veneration of composer gods and their medium priests, especially the conductor and soloists. This sort of behavior would be disquieting at the very least to performers in many other genres. Classical concert behavior is different, however, in operas, where it is permissible to applaud after an aria, opera aficionados being allowed to show their fandom, rather like the jazz lovers who demonstrate their perspicacity by applauding after a particularly good solo, though this practice has become a matter of politesse and is now routinely offered after every solo. Indian classical music is supported by a robust theory of rasa, in which listeners can achieve a kind of transcendental state. Other sorts of concerts are different still. Irish traditional music sessions, at which I'm a frequent participant, are yet another type, since they aren't really concerts or performances, as I said, or viewed by musicians as performances or gigs, but background music to people in pubs. We like it when venues are quiet enough so that we can hear one another, which usually means an empty or sparsely populated pub. But at the same time, we very much appreciate the audience's recognition in the form of applause, compliments, and tips. We whoop and applaud for each other, especially for singers, since songs are fairly rare, at least in my session. Got the right one? Yes. Let me begin at this point to flesh out the claim that musical performances and other sorts of public acts can serve as media of value. The moment of the performance is the moment when value can be transmitted and can be realized, which needs to be witnessed by the presence of the audience. So I write can be witnessed in this previous sentence, and potentially earlier, as I already explained, because as everybody knows who has attended any sort of public gathering, there are always plenty of people who are unmoved or not paying attention. Some do not receive the transmission or take issue with its delivery. While there is an anthropological literature on value, there isn't much that considers performance as a medium of value. This notion comes from David Graeber's work on value, which provides a useful rehearsal of the writings of Terence Turner on this issue. Unfortunately, much of what Graeber relies on in making his argument is drawn from unpublished materials by Turner on the rituals of the Kayapó people of Brazil, so I am thus forced to rely on Graeber's glosses rather than on Turner's own writings. Rather than offer a third-hand account here, that is, summarizing Graeber's summaries, I will need to quote directly from Graeber. Terry Turner was famous for writing a lot but publishing, being a perfectionist and not allowing much to be published. Graeber begins to make his case about acts of performance via Turner by noting that there are two key values in Kayapó culture, beauty and dominance. Here's a quote from Graeber going over Turner. The Kayapó notion of beauty implies perfection, completion, and finesse. It is evinced most of all in the harmony of a grand ceremonial that unites an entire Kayapó community, of which the giving of beautiful names is perhaps the exemplary form. In the communal sphere, these two are combined in certain forms of public performance. These are, in ascending order of prestige, a kind of mournful keening performed by elder women at public events, the formal oratory with which senior men harangue the community on matters of collective import, and most of all, a form of oratorial chanting called ben, whose use is limited to chiefs. These represent the pinnacles of social value in Kayapó society because they are seen as combining completely uninhibited self-expression, that is, a complete lack of deference, hence untrammeled dominance with a consummate mastery and fullness of style that is the epitome of beauty. That's the end of the quote. Graeber argues that value is realized in public communal spaces in the forms of first circulating media of value, ceremonial valuables and social roles, but also in the form of access to what are thought to be the most prestigious types of verbal performance in public: keening, formal oratory, and chiefly chanting. How can money and something like chiefly chanting both be media of value? Graeber argues that they are measures of value in that they quantify or hierarchize whatever a particular valued quality might be. Such measurement can take any of three possible forms, he says. The first is presence or absence. People possess wealth or they don't. The second possible form is ranking. With respect to Kaipo society, men's oratory is usually seen as superior to women's keening, and chiefly chanting is viewed as superior to both. And third, there is proportionality, as with money. People possess varying amounts of it. Graeber continues to argue that both money and chanting are media of value, since they are the material ways that value is realized. In both cases, value must be realized in some material form, whether concrete or in a witness performance. Performances either conjure these values in a way that are perceptible to the audience, or offer things that can be translated into tokens that do bring these values into existence. An important question in this context is the degree to which value can be stored. For economic forms of value, it is obvious that value can be stored as money or some other sort of token. According to Graeber, this is an extreme form of value. At the other extreme, social value is stored in things like rituals or performances, for which it is not possible to make a distinction between the spheres of circulation and realization. Media of value, such as performances, must be circulated and realized together. So the foregoing is pretty much all Graeber has to say on the question of performance as a medium of value. After the discussion that I've just outlined, Graeber then pivots away from considerations of value among the Kaipo to make a generalization about different spheres or units where value is produced in capitalist societies, workplaces and households, which are mediated by the marketplace. This is something that Georgia went over today, so I'm happy to reinforce it. Oh, there you are. Workplaces produce economic values through commodities, the production of commodities. Households produce social values. The market, however, acts as a kind of force of social amnesia, he says, of which commodity fetishism is a facet. People in households have no knowledge of the people in the workplace who produce the commodities used in households, while people in the workplace have no knowledge of the social values produced in households. So he has a nice chart. That's a chart from his book. Graeber then goes on to discuss the production of social values in more traditional societies in which the units of workplace and households don't really apply. There is mainly only the latter. But even in these societies, there are other spheres in which values circulate and can be realized. Graeber, however, doesn't consider these other spheres in contemporary complex societies, which is striking since there is a good deal of literature on this public sphere in several disciplines, and a great deal of literature that considers sporting events, festivals, and ceremonies as rituals. My interest specifically concerns musical performances as media of the potential transmission or consummation of non-economic forms of value in contemporary capitalist societies. Graeber examines traditional societies' home practices and rituals, but in contemporary societies, he only considers home practices, ignoring public rituals, ceremonies, performances. And moving from the Kaipo, who have a public space, to contemporary societies, Graeber excised all of the ways that value might be realized outside of the workplace or the domestic sphere, in places relatively insulated from the market and the home. He mentions churches and museums in another context, sort of in passing. But I would also add other sorts of public spaces or events, such as musical performances, of course, and sporting events. You know, some of you might have heard of the World Cup, for example. Value is transmitted here, too. This immensely complicates Graeber's model. Of course, it becomes difficult to talk about values in, say, American society if we are considering a symphony concert, a football game, a church service. Different sorts of values can be and are realized in different sorts of public events. Public performances can serve to transmit the sorts of values that are produced at home but can't be realized at home. This is one of the things that performances are for, I would say. The transmission and hoped for realization of values taught, inculcated in the home, but are social values of the sort that can only be realized collectively in public. We need to clear more space for the public as a space apart from the workplace and the home where values can be realized. So I write realized, not created, because my argument is that there are some values that, while they might be created in the domestic unit of the home, cannot be potentially realized except in public. You can learn from your parents that it is important to learn how to share with others, but you can't really put this idea into practice until you get out of the domestic space. I mean, I was very bad at sharing with my younger sister, but I was pretty good at sharing with my friends. The public must thus be added to Graeber's formulation of these two units of capitalist societies as a kind of proving ground where some of the values learned at home might be realized or enacted in ways that would be difficult or impossible at home, or as a counter-public space in which general social values might be contested. A quick example that will have to suffice for the time being is, my favorite example, because I'm a musician, the Irish traditional music session, which I have also studied as a medium of value, though in a different context. The main value of the session, an informal gathering, usually in a bar, as we heard from Felix, is, I argued, sociality, a kind of musicalized hanging out. The importance of sociality can be learned at home, but can't be realized without others. Performances also require a good deal of activity, what, drawing on Graeber, I've elsewhere called meaningful action, but will simply refer to here as action. I'm in general agreement with Graeber's theory of value as a theory of action. That is, the actions of social actors reveal what it is that they value. Sometimes these actions can be considered to be labor in Marx's sense, productive labor that produces surplus value for capitalists. But there are many other forms of action that do not generate surplus value, but produce other sorts of value. In general, for Graeber, quote, value is the way our actions take on meaning or importance by becoming incorporated into something larger than ourselves, unquote. And I'm in general agreement with this broader position. With respect to the actions of musicians, we need to recognize, as Graeber and Turner and many other non-musicians fail to do, that a good deal of preparation usually goes into musical performances or other sorts of public performances. While they may seem to be impromptu or ephemeral to viewers or listeners, they are in fact the products of a good deal of individual and collective action. Musical performances and other sorts of public events aren't just media of value, but the products of practicing and preparation, arguments and compromises, all of which I would call action. This is obvious to musicians, but most, or even all musicians, have often been faced with the assumptions that they simply show up and perform effortlessly without prior effort. It really makes me mad when that happens. Performances, I am arguing, are not simply media of value, public realizations of value, but nodes in an array of processes and networks of practicing, rehearsing, as well as instrument and equipment building or buying, maintenance and repair, costume design and manufacture, and much more, all of which come together in public performances. Through all of these and other actions, value is put in escrow, stored, to be transmitted later at the performance. Or sometimes performances takes days. In the case of the Kiseje, right, who Tony Seeger studied, as documented by Seeger, in which case all of the teaching, learning, and arguing is part of the performance itself, usually coming to some sort of recognized climax or culmination. It might be useful at this point to recall Marcel Mauss, writing of Northwestern North American potlatches, quote, "There are repeated festivals, continuous and long drawn out, at a wedding or at various kinds of ritual or promotions, everything stored up with great industry during the summer and autumn on one of the richest coasts in the world is lavishly expended," unquote. All of these acts, whether a storing and more for potlatches or practicing and rehearsing and more for musical performances, are forms of action that build value, which is then displayed and potentially transmitted in certain key moments that are socially and culturally agreed upon as key moments. In this context, while I share Graeber's and Turner's realization of the importance of performance, I am disagreeing with them somewhat. Value isn't stored in performances or rituals or festivals. It is built up through various actions, usually a good deal of them, that happen off stage, as it were, prior to what is socially recognized as the performance. Performances are the moment when all of these actions are culturally and socially understood to be realized in public. In a real sense, then, the value of all these actions is realized at the moment of performance. Performance can only serve as a medium of value when it occurs as a performance for or with others in public. Such transmissions of value not only require audiences, but reasonably attentive or appreciative audiences. Nothing is more disappointing to a live performer of any sort, musical, theatrical, or other, than to have an unappreciative audience. Audience approbation is necessary if value has a chance of being realized. Performer-audience interactions are thus more than that. They are moments of exchange. The accumulated actions of the musicians are put on display, and those actions are recognized by the audience. Value is realized in the exchange. This point is rather Marxian. Just as we can't know the exchange value of something until there is someone who has a use value for it and is willing to pay, the social realization of value of a performance doesn't occur until it is made public and acknowledged. This is not, however, what I would call the consumption of the performance, but the validation of it, the recognition of exchange, the potential realization of value. Anthropologist Jane Fagins makes a similar argument on the question of exchange by writing that exchange is the moment when the latent value made in production processes and embedded in their products is turned into forms of value that are publicly recognized. Exchange is thus how social actors' investment in production is given recognized social meaning. Fagin sees social life as a quest for value or meaning, I would say, not forgetting Gertz, and she views exchange as the way that quest is consummated. For her, exchange and circulation are the context in which values stored in action, goods, or social actors are socially realized, by which she means they are integrated into a web of social relations as they become publicly recognized, ratified, revealed, or transferred from one person to the next. Value is thus not exhausted with the conclusion of the performance, for musicians continue to act, learning from previous performances, building on them, aiming towards the next one. Fagins also writes that displays of value can circulate in the public domain without exchange taking place. And it is much the same for passing displays of values, such as musical performances. As I've argued elsewhere, drawing on Michael Lambeck, more ephemeral media of value can continue to exist after they occur. People remember such events, discuss them, photograph them, make video or audio recordings of them, thus continuing the circulation of value for which these photographs or recordings or other memorabilia become tokens. Before turning to a specific case study, I need to make a point also about the importance of attending to the specificities of particular tokens of value. According to Turner and Graeber, we should pay attention to the nature of the media through which social value is realized. Graeber argues that tokens of value, material or not, come to be seen as ends in themselves. People see the tokens of value not as tools through which value can be realized or measured, but as embodiments of value themselves, even as the origins of those values. That is, media of value aren't just media of value, they possess their own qualities that are worth examining. Gertz actually said much the same thing about religious symbols, not only making the point that meanings need to be stored in symbols, but that symbols take on an importance of their own apart from what they are thought to represent. I have a quote from Gertz. I can't resist quoting his writing because it's so beautiful. Such religious symbols, dramatized in rituals or related in myths, are felt somewhere to sum up, for those for whom they are resonant, what is known about the way the world is, the quality of the emotional life it supports, and the way one ought to behave while in it. Sacred symbols thus relate an ontology and a cosmology to an aesthetic and a morality. Their particular power comes from their presumed ability to identify fact with value at the most fundamental level, to give to what is otherwise merely actual a comprehensive, normative import. That's the end of the quote. From Religion as a Cultural System, that famous piece. For Goetz, meanings or values or feelings are not simply floating about in a culture, but are part of broader systems, whether one wants to call them, as he does, ethos or worldview. This is the reason that Graeber needed to spend some time in his book discussing the idea of the totality. Many a theory has been dismissed as totalizing, but at the same time, if one thinks ethnographically, people in any culture employ theories that, for them, are viewed as explaining the world as it appears, and indeed for them, truly is. As Graeber explains in the introduction to his book, quote, "Value can best be seen in this light, as the way in which actions become meaningful to the actor by being incorporated in some larger social totality, even if in many cases the totality in question exists primarily in the actor's imagination," unquote. Actually, I need to take a drink of water. In one of his few forays into commenting on cultural production, Goetz made it clear that to study cultural production is to study culture itself. Another quote from Goetz: "This realization that to study an art form is to explore a sensibility, that such a sensibility is essentially a collective formation, and that the foundations of such a formation are as wide as social existence and as deep, leads away not only from the view that aesthetic power is a grandiloquence for the pleasures of craft, it leads away also from the so-called functionalist view that has most often been opposed to it. That is, the works of art are elaborate mechanisms for defining social relationships, sustaining social rules, and strengthening social values," unquote. Artworks, broadly understood, for Goetz, quote, "materialize a way of experiencing, bring a particular cast of mind out into the world," unquote, where others can apprehend it. We have some excellent models in ethnomusicology that accomplish this sort of study, books that have served as models and inspirations for many, not just Seeger's book, Why Suya Sing, but also Stephen Fell's Sound and Sentiment, Louise Menkes' books, including a recent book, Dust of the Zulu, Christopher Waterman's Juju, and many others. Rather than rehearsing these or other excellent books, I will offer a brief case study, one that is pretty much canonical in ethnomusicology, which means that attempting to theorize it might resonate with many of you. The case in question is one that I hope will illustrate the utility, not just of theory in general, but a particular body of theory that I've recently found to be useful, this body of theory about value. This particular case, Isakatamiya music from South Africa, today operates in multiple regimes of value, regimes that are local and international, in which Isakatamiya can be a commodity as an internationally recognized sound, a sound of Africa. I do not mean to imply here that Isakatamiya wasn't a commodity before Paul Simon came along and before Ladysmith Black Mambazo became famous on Paul Simon's Graceland album. Commercial recordings of it existed before that. I am primarily interested in Isakatamiya as a performed music in competition. There are, of course, some excellent studies of this music already, especially those by perhaps its greatest student, Veit Ehrlmann. What can theoretical or focus on questions of value add to what Ehrlmann has brilliantly written about Isakatamiya music? Let me talk about this music here in terms of value from the perspective of the social actors involved, as best I can without my own ethnography. For empirical data, I rely on the excellent secondary literature by Ehrlmann and others, and some of this literature refers to Zulu conceptions of value. Ehrlmann, for example, writes of competition itself as a pre-colonial value of its later practitioners. There are also valuable studies that argue that Isakatamiya carries older Zulu values, and Isakatamiya as a complex melding of practices of competition from two different cultures. According to Erlman, quote, much of the course of Izakatamiya history was influenced by an uneasy balance between the two modes of competitive performance, the urban middle class concert and the rural stick fight, unquote. Competition thus seems to be one Zulu value that carries over into the colonial, post-colonial apartheid context. Another one that I would argue for, and we'll spend some time on, is that Izakatamiya competitions in the apartheid era were to display community-defined conceptions of excellence. Excellence as an urban Zulu value. These competitions were a way of demonstrating that in an environment where indigenous people lacked access to all legitimate forms of power, political, juridical, economic, and much more, they were still capable of defining for themselves what excellence was, aspiring to meet the loftiest heights of communally defined excellence in Izakatamiya performances. I would not characterize this as resistance, or perhaps better put, as resistance only. This is the indigenous construction and maintenance and participation in a different regime of value, in which white South Africans had no voice, no role, except one, which I will discuss in a minute. Izakatamiya competitions were a world apart from colonialism and apartheid, even as they are, or were, caught up in colonialism and apartheid. They were a way for people to define what they believed matters, what was meaningful to them, and to continually enact and refine those beliefs, those meanings, those values through public competitions, public performances. These public displays of communal values are made with participation of the audience, the behavior of which is strictly managed. Izakatamiya participants make clear distinctions between rehearsals and performances, both of which are public. Audience behavior is strictly controlled, as is the movement and placement of musicians vis-a-vis the audience. As one observer wrote, quote, during the practice, the men wear normal street clothes, and members of the audience are allowed to whistle and clap. During the actual competition, however, the men dress immaculately in elegant and more often than not tailored outfits, and the audience must remain quiet so as not to influence the judges, unquote. As Joseph Shabalala, the famous leader of Ladysmith Black Mambazo, as he told Veit Eilman, when Ladysmith Black Mambazo went from Durban to Johannesburg in 1973, his group wasn't permitted to participate in the competition in Johannesburg because they were already well known and better than the other groups in that city. Here's a quote from Shabalala from Eilman. We had the largest following, he said. They so much loved us that after each rendition, people would applaud, and the rule was that people should not applaud. The first time our performance was canceled. Then during the second performance, it was announced to the audience that they were allowed to applaud all groups entering the stage and also applaud when the group leaves the stage after singing. This obviously was an attempt to prevent people to give us the loudest applause. Nevertheless, the audience responded as requested. But when we entered, there was a difference in the applause, which was putting us ahead of the other groups, unquote. Competitions, therefore, take on their own meanings in and of themselves, in addition to the value for which they serve as a medium, as I talked about earlier. It is also the case that actions or objects can often be fetishized and assumed to be the sources of value, rather than the media through which value also circulates, right? This is something I discussed already. Drawing on Jane Fagins again, Graeber says that both actions and objects can become models or miniature representations of the forms of action that they ultimately represent. A particular ceremony or regalia or whatever token is a microcosm of the entire system of production of which they are a part. Such objects encode a theory of creativity that Graeber thinks is implicit in everyday life. He admits that this is commonplace enough, a commonplace enough observation, but wants to emphasize creativity. Even the most mundane acts are acts of symbolic production, for they are the main ways that people's most basic definitions of what people are reproduced. The belief in the construction of society through Izakatamiya competitions and the valorization of excellence is made clear in the adjudication of the competitions. It's significant that until fairly recently, the only role outsiders were permitted to play in Isakatamiya competitions was that of the judge, usually a white South African, a stranger. A white South African was picked because he or she was known to none of the competitors and was therefore thought to be completely impartial. Carol Muller, the ethnomusicologist, writes of her experience as a judge in 1984, being seated with her back to the audience so that she and her fellow judge would not be influenced by the various performers' supporters behind them. Only with this extreme objectivity, I would argue, could true excellence be determined, value be transmitted and potentially realized. Choosing white judges is no longer the standard practice, and I would say that this shift has occurred for complex reasons, which I don't have time to get into. Erlman, in his comprehensive work on Isakatamiya, notes how song texts include performers' praise of themselves as part of their efforts to gain prestige and establish their names, and observes that the most basic form of self-praise occurs in lyrics that mention some sign of excellence and social achievement by the use of personal pronouns. Common phrases are used to command excellence in performance. But I am arguing that excellence is even more important than this in the competitions during the apartheid era. It was perhaps the main value that was nurtured and protected, and for which Isakatamiya competitions were both the medium and the realization. In some respects, there is little one could add to the voluminous work on Isakatamiya by Erlman and others, but I want to pull out of that work the idea of excellence as a value that compelled participation and in part drove the competition. Following Gertz, as I have done throughout this presentation, it is important that ethnography and its analysis privilege what is meaningful and valuable to social actors. The concept of value serves, as I have argued here and elsewhere, as a useful tool for this endeavor. If we compare the regime of value of Isakatamiya competitions to the regime of value of Isakatamiya as world music, following the success of Paul Simon's Grammy-winning Graceland album from 1986, it is easier to see these regimes for what they are, different regimes in which different conceptions of value obtain. Those forms of value visible in Isakatamiya competitions are wholly different from the forms of value represented by commercial recordings of this music or university concert series performances, even if the music sounds much the same. One of Michael Lambeck's points about what he calls ethical value, his term for the sorts of values that are derived from acts that cannot be considered to be productive labor, that is productive of economic value, is that ethical values are incommensurable, unlike the values that result from productive labor. The price of goods with economic forms of value makes commensurability a simple matter. But it's not possible to say that a particular performance of, say, violinist Joshua Bell playing Bach is more or less valuable than a performance by Ladysmith Black Mambazo in terms of ethical value. This does not mean, however, that ethical values cannot be brought into an economic regime of value, as has happened with many musics from around the world, with the creation of the category of world music and the rise of interest in this music in the late 1980s and after. Carol Muller writes of Joseph Shabalala's efforts to recast Isakatamiya as traditional music in the 1990s, which was, it seems to me, a way of attempting to make it commensurable with an economic regime of value, turning Isakatamiya into world music, then a newly created niche in the Anglo-American dominated recording industry. But of course, such efforts also affect the composition of the audience for the music and the relationship of the audience to the musician. Considering questions of value help us focus on what is meaningful to social actors, as Gertz exhorted us to do, and I have been as well in these few days. Doing so helps us move beyond what are the still common functionalist explanations for how people or social groups make and relate to music. Value helps us find out what matters to people. As Graeber, drawing on Turner, points out, the ultimate stake in politics, and this again is something that Georgia reminded us of, the ultimate stakes in politics are not about the appropriation of value, but the struggle to establish what value is. Our study should take such struggles into consideration. One of the main benefits of employing the perspective gleaned from this value literature is that it offers ways of developing understandings of forms of value that are non-economic. This is not going beyond Marx or other theories of economic forms of value, but engaging with them, complementing them, so that we can understand how value might be produced in non-economic situations. Value is stored in material things, such as money or material goods, but it is also created and collected in people's actions that are socially understood to culminate in a public display of some sort, such as a performance, whether musical or a ritual or a sporting event or something else. Value is produced in the home and the workplace in capitalist societies, as Graeber argues, but sometimes it needs to be displayed or communicated in public spaces in socially and culturally understood moments of performance. Public performances can transmit values in moments of exchange that resonate both with markets and the workplace, as well as the home. But they can also, as in the case of Isakatamiya music, display forms of value that cannot be realized either in the home or in the marketplace, such as the sociality of Irish traditional music sessions or Isakatamiya. But it is not just the performers who communicate and potentially realize value. In order for it to be realized, value must be transmitted to audiences. The display, realization, consummation of social values requires a society of performers and audiences for whom the performed values are, as Gertz said about religious symbols, understood to be expressions of something broader and more fundamental to that society than they might appear to be. As societies around the world change with ever greater rapidity, attending to questions concerning the struggles over value and the preservation of it become increasingly urgent. Thank you.